Hi guys, Hannah here from Hannahmariaplans and welcome back to another video. In today's video I'll be setting up my bullet journal for March 2020, and whilst I'd normally be showing you a little flip through of the previous month, we have a lot to do, so we're going to hop right into the first page. Back in January, the stationery company Staedtler approached me inquiring whether I wanted to collaborate on a new project, which I have been so excited about. They're not sponsoring this video and I didn't receive any money in exchange for the collaboration, but they did send me a ton of product and asked me to create something specifically with watercolour pencils from their Be Arty range. It had to be filmed in quite a specific format, which is why the footage is a bit strange for this video and we are going to speed through it, but bear with me because I was really happy with the result. I've never used watercolour pencils before and needed to do a bit of research from various YouTube videos and blogs before I could even start forming a design. I wasn't given a specific theme other than something to do with spring, and when I saw the colour selection available to me, cherry blossoms sprang to mind. I found a couple of reference images and did a few rough sketches before I was ready for the real thing. So my final design shows a clear blue sky with mountains disappearing into the background, reflected in the rippling water with a dark red bridge crossing over. The all-important element of the cherry blossom branches stretch in from each side in various shades of pink. I wasn't sure about the techniques I should be using even after watching tutorials, so did a mixture. I started by colouring the pencil directly onto watercolour paper and blending it out with a flat brush. It was really satisfying watching the pencils just melt away. I also drew a little circle onto a scrap piece of paper and treated it like a blob of actual paint. I found this particularly useful for colour mixing. And the other main technique I used was dabbing the brush directly onto the nib of the pencil to get the most pigment I possibly could. I also found a big white pencil really useful to help cover up some of the areas I didn't like so much. It didn't get rid of them completely, but it did make them a bit more hazy, so I could then layer on top. I'm sure this isn't conventional, but it did seem to work okay. The main similarity I found compared to watercolour paints is the use of layers to build up the colour and vibrancy. These are likely the equivalent of student grade pencils, so it might be that higher quality pencils require less layering and are slightly smoother to work with. Once the painting was complete, I scanned it in and printed out a copy to stick in my journal. I sadly can't offer prints of this cover page because it will be used on Staedtler merchandise as part of their advertising campaign for the Be Arty range. But I have recently updated my Etsy shop with new prints, so be sure to check that out if you're looking for inspiration for your next theme. Moving onto the calendar page, I wanted to keep the spring vibes going, so decided to stick with the cherry blossom theme. To me, flowers like cherry blossoms and daffodils are always the first sign that spring is coming, and that, along with the lighter mornings in the UK, really helps to lift my spirits. On the right side of the page, I'm extending my landscape from the original painting. I got caught out by thinking the paper was drier than it was, resulting in the colour from the mountains bleeding quite a lot and not giving me a nice clean edge. I tried to use tape to neaten it up a bit, but it wasn't the most successful endeavour. I think I used my hairdryer extensively for the rest of the paintings this week. I also forgot to press record on the first layer of cherry blossoms. You'll see this is a running trend throughout the video, and I forgot that the bridge needed to go in before the cherry blossoms. This page was definitely a lesson in persevering when you keep making silly mistakes. The cherry blossoms themselves are made from little dots of pink paint in varying shades from light to dark to create highlights and shadows. I splodge it pretty randomly until I'm happy with the effect, and it's definitely something you could achieve with markers as well. Make sure you tag me over on Instagram if you do decide to give it a go. Recreations are always the highlight of my day. Once I was happy with the calendar and cover page, I moved on to my next set of spreads, which is going to be my habits on the left side and my projects on the right side. I started again with a reference picture of a sea of cherry blossoms surrounding a temple with Mount Fuji in the background. To me, cherry blossoms are always closely linked to thoughts of Japan, and as I have wanted to do a theme based around Japan for quite a while, I thought I would include it where I could. I tried to do a bit of research into cherry blossoms in preparation for this voiceover, because I am actually quite ignorant of what it represents in Japanese culture, despite knowing that it is significant. I read that the flower is symbolic of spring, a time of renewal and the fleeting nature of life. After their beauty peaks around 2 weeks, the blossoms start to fall, and it's in this season that Japanese people have a custom called hanami, literally meaning watching blossoms, where they enjoy eating and drinking with friends, colleagues and family underneath the cherry blossoms. This sounds like the most beautiful tradition, and it's one of my dreams to travel to Japan and experience the cherry blossoms one day. I'd love to know if you have any other facts or personal experience with cherry blossoms, so please let me know in the comments below. The colours that I've been using so far for these paintings is ultramarine blue for the sky and mountain, quinacridone rose for the cherry blossoms, a hand-mixed dark brown for the roof of the temple, and this gorgeous perylene maroon for the dark red. The perylene colours have got to be some of my favourite watercolours ever. I've been adding in some white to the rose colour to create more opacity and contrast for the flowers, and mixing in a little of the perylene maroon to deepen the colour and add shadows. I wanted to create a little extra detail to the cherry blossom at the very bottom of the page to make it look like it's closer to us. I'm setting up my usual habit in the same format as before, and I enjoyed my Kanban spread for the project so much last time that I thought I'd bring it back. This time it's in a vertical layout because that worked better with the spread, but the categories and premise are the same. If you'd like to know a bit more about the Kanban spread, I'll link you to my February setup where I talk about it in more detail. Once I was finished drawing all of those little lines, I was ready to move on to my next spread, which was my to-do list. I've been using this layout for a few months, where you write down the tasks on one side, and once they're completed, you put a dot in the corresponding date with a line drawn through the task itself. This month, I've made a couple of slight changes due to the smaller dot spacing of the almanac journal. So there is a square between each date and only one column for tasks. Since finishing this spread, I realised I want to be able to separate my general tasks from my arty tasks, so I've drawn a line across the grid halfway down the page. The decoration for this spread is a bit more simple, with some doodled cherry blossoms painted in gouache rather than watercolour. I tried to use paler colours for the outside of the flower, with darker pinks for the middle. In retrospect, I wish the background to this spread had been a bit paler. I had originally wanted to leave the flowers without an outline, but could see them getting lost on the page. I therefore decided to draw around them with a black pen and finished off the spread by adding little golden dots with my jelly roll. The next spread actually turned out to be the most time-consuming of them all. I had it in my head that I wanted to include one of the traditional Japanese gates in my setup, and of course needed to include the cherry blossom to tie in with the rest of my theme. On the left, I plan to have my Instagram scheduling page where I like to set out what I'm going to post and when, which is particularly important this month as I'm also posting all of the pictures and videos from my new journal setup. On the right, I wanted a full page illustration. I actually used quite a few colours rather than keeping to a limited palette. This included Hansa Yellow Deep, which is a dark yellow, Quinacridone Rose, Permanent Alizarin Crimson, Perylene Maroon, Cerulean Blue, Perylene Green, and finally Neutral Tint. In other journals, I would have painted this onto watercolour paper and stuck it in, but I decided that this notebook had held up so well so far that it was only fair to put it through its paces. I started out with a pencil sketch taken from lots of different pictures of the gate before creating an underpainting using the wet in wet technique, making sure the colours were blended and that I left some white showing through to create some light. I then started to build up the surrounding plants and trees in multiple layers. I tried to be really careful with my colours. For example, if something had the sunlight shining onto it, not only should it be lighter, but also tinted with warm colours such as orangey yellows. This would later help it contrast with the cooler shadows. The other thing I tried to bear in mind is that the closer plants would be darker, and as always, the things further away would be darker. These Japanese gates are also called tori. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. And they typically represent the entrance to a Shinto shrine and mark the transition from the mundane to the sacred. They are traditionally made from wood or stone and can be different shapes, but most either have the flat top or the upwards curving ends, which I'm doing here. In popular culture, the gates are normally shown in red, which symbolises vitality and protection against evil, but the original colour is actually white, which stands for sacredness. I chose my gate to be red because I thought it would tie into my theme better, and honestly, I just can't get enough of the Perylene Maroon paint. When it came to adding some more details, I got out my gouache. This was partly so I could add some more bold and opaque leaves to the foliage, but also to smooth out some of the areas, for example, of the stairs, and create a path leading away behind the gate. I've never worked in this mixed media style before and found it a surprisingly large adjustment. Getting the consistency and brightness of the gouache correct so that it stood out on the watercolour was quite difficult for me, and I was quite concerned for the most of the painting that I had bitten off way more than I can chew. This felt like a really complex landscape for me, with so many small elements and little details that were important in order to be able to transform what I had in my mind onto paper. It only really felt like it left the ugly stage once I started to get the highlights in close to the end. The final touch was adding some white gouache, which had just a touch of yellow or green in it, and splattering it over the bottom of the page to add some extra little flowers. Despite this taking a really long time, I'm really proud of how it has turned out. The final spread of this video is of course our first weekly spread of the month. After doing such a complicated and time-consuming page, I needed something really simple. I was inspired by Nabar from Whimsical Journal's latest theme, with some weaving leaves in green and gold, so decided to do my own spin on it, adding in the cherry blossom flowers. I'm using the Perylene green paint mixed with a little white gouache to make it more opaque to fill in the stem and most of the leaves, making sure I leave a couple blank so they can be coloured in with gold a bit later on. I'm then using this peach colour for the flowers, and unlike earlier, I'm keeping them one flat colour rather than introducing any variation. I quite like the matte effect that this gives. The thing I like most about this design is that it would be just as easy and look just as good using a felt tip or paint marker or even gel pens as it does using paint. The remaining leaves can be coloured in using the same gel pen as earlier in the setup, and I finish off each side with a dark green border. I have to use the washi tape to keep the line vaguely straight. Even with the dots, I seem to have a remarkable talent for wonky lines. The finishing touches are writing in the days of the week in white so they stand out, and outlining the flowers in a really thin nibbed fineliner. And we're done. With that, here is the final flip through of my March setup. This theme turned out even better than I imagined it in my head. Something about it makes me feel so hopeful for new beginnings, and the colours are just really soothing, which is perfect as it has just been so hectic. With all of that done, we've come to the end. If this is the first video that you've seen from me, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. I just want to take a moment to say thank you for spending your time hanging out with me on this video. I really appreciate all of your support. I'll see you in my next one. Bye guys.